given the overwhelmingly disproportionate funding toward enforcement activities compared to taxpayer services, would you agree that some of the IRA enforcement funds could be more effectively spent on improving customer service? And could you just elaborate on that point a bit?
Thank you, Senator Thune. Yes, certainly they could. And the problem with the 9 paragraphs in the Inflation Reduction Act that describe how the IRS money will be devoted to various functions, I think it fails to account for overlap. In the taxpayer services category, for example, it specifies that certain amounts of funding will go to taxpayer advocate services. In the enforcement side, certain amounts of funding will go to litigation. In the IRS Strategic Operating Plan, in the enforcement section, there's an item describing how the service wants to put more people into appeals. You've got overlaps among the funding that we don't really understand yet. And I think we need to consider holistically that, yes, taxpayer services and other items can increase compliance. At a recent symposium by the Tax Policy Center, Nina Olson, the former national taxpayer advocate, says, we're good at measuring non-compliance, or at least we think we are, when it comes to audit rates and the like. What about compliance when taxpayer services improve? We've not measured that impact sufficiently. I think one of the most telling quotes came when Ernie Dronenberg, who was a former revenue official from California, he made the equation this way: a 0.5% increase in voluntary compliance raises $400 million a year for his state. Doubling the audit rate raises half that much.
So would having the IRS update its IRA spending plan annually and requiring regular oversight hearings before the relevant committees of jurisdiction provide some of the greater accountability of the $80 billion funding that we're talking about here? And maybe if so, could you talk about how?
Well, I think that Congress can't go at it alone. There certainly has to be a series of reports set up for the agency to describe in detail where the money is going, and answering this question of how exactly this funding for auditing high-income individuals is going. There's, of course, the Criminal Investigation Division, whose funding is very important, but Commissioner Werfel himself has said their hires for CID will be somewhere around 3% of the total they intend to hire. If we want to keep funding CID, that's a pretty minor amount of increase. We can do that.
Right.
There are other things, though, that have to come along with it, like preparing the IT infrastructure for going after cyber criminals. Treasury Inspector General recently said that the IRS failed to meet 17 of 20 standard cybersecurity criteria developed government-wide. If we're going to be dealing with the worst of the worst in cyber criminals going forward, we need to have a secure infrastructure that isn't going to be hacked.
And oversight and accountability that come with it. So, Mr. Edwards, in your testimony, you state that the IRS estimates show that the tax gap's not rising relative to the size of the economy, and the U.S. tax gap appears to be modest by international standards. Could you elaborate on how the U.S. tax gap stacks up against other countries, including those in the EU?
There's a number of studies internationally. It is difficult to compare tax gap between countries. Few countries do detailed tax gaps like our IRS does, but there's 5 or 6 studies I cited in my testimony that look at tax gaps across European countries and the United States. Generally, our tax gap is lower as a share of GDP. They're different, which is a little surprising. I mean, Europe relies a lot on VAT taxes, which are actually easier to force compliance with than income taxes. So, you know, and our tax gap has not increased over time. You can look at the IRS tax gap estimates back a few decades, and the tax gap has not increased. And here's the important point with enforcement, I think, is that it's not all black and white, but there is diminishing benefits when you increase enforcement. There's a fascinating chart in the GIO study last year on enforcement that shows if you look at people earning over $5 million, Today, when they're audited, 40% of them have no tax change. A decade ago, when the audit rate was higher, 60% of them had no change. So if you expand the auditing on wealthy people in this case, you make more errors. You go after a lot more people who haven't cheated, who haven't made errors. And one of the reasons is a lot of high-income folks, they hire expert CPA and CPA companies who don't want to make mistakes. They got their reputations online, and if you look at the auditing data in the annual IRS data book, the folks at the top end actually on audit, their mistakes are smaller relatively than people in the middle. So I think it's a bit off base to say that there's all this cheating going on at the top end. Of course, there's some. We need to enforce it. But the relative error and cheating at the top end is smaller, actually, than in the middle and at the bottom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
Senator Graff.